My name is Mark Bellamy. I'm the director of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and it's my happy responsibility to welcome you all this morning to the Introduction to African Security Issues course here at ACSS. You're a pretty large group. This is a large enrollment, a large number of participants for this course, which I think is great. I think that testifies not only to your interest in African issues and in the subject matter, but also to the growing global importance of Africa, the importance we attach to Africa as a government. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Africa Center, who we are, and what we do. And after that, I believe we'll have a group photo, and you will get some administrative announcements, and then we'll launch right away into the program itself. But before doing that, I wanted just to briefly share with you a couple of thoughts about the growing global importance of Africa. 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when we thought about Africa, if we thought about it at all, probably three things came to mind. One was that it was a zone of seemingly intractable conflict. If you go back to the beginning of the decade, 1999, 2000, Africa was engulfed by wars and insurgency. Three major civil wars raging on the continent in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Angola. West Africa, which seemed to be in a state of near anarchy, and no really good solutions for how to deal with this conflict. No good solutions from the United States, from our other major international partners, from the UN, or from the Africa regional organizations. We also thought about the poverty and the persistent backwardness of Africa, and the fact that by 2000, in so many African countries, so many socioeconomic indicators had turned the wrong way and continued the wrong way and been that way for decades. Some of you may remember a famous, even an infamous cover of The Economist. I think this was in 2000, late 2000, Africa, the Hopeless Continent, which seemed to sum up this pessimism about the conflict, the persistent backwardness, and the poverty, Africa's inability to break out of this cycle, and our inability to conceptualize ways we might help Africa to break out of that cycle. And the third thing that many of us were focused on at that time was the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Back in 1999 and 2000, we already saw the initial effects of this pandemic in Africa. There was widespread concern that unchecked, this epidemic would wipe out entire generations, would certainly hit hardest the educated classes in Africa, the civil servants, the professionals, the teachers, and would have devastating socioeconomic results, impacts across the continent. At that time, again, we had no answer to this problem other than to encourage Africans to abstain and to promote more research. Adding to those three factors, after 9/11, the United States, had a fourth preoccupation with regard to Africa, and it was that the conditions I've just described, along with Africa's porous borders and shaky governance in many areas, would make Africa an ideal terrain for terrorist organizations to take refuge, to recruit, to operate, and eventually to strike out against the United States or our allies or interests globally. And this concern about Africa as a vulnerable and open space was really the driving force of much U.S. policy in Africa over the past decade. And I think one could make the argument that everything from our enormous HIV/AIDS PEPFAR, President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, to the establishment of a Combined Joint Task Force of Africa in Djibouti, to the creation of Africa, can be traced to this overriding concern that something needed to be done preventively to deal with Africa's problems so that Africa did not emerge as a terror threat to the United States. Well, now we're in 2011, and if you take a look at all of the factors that I've just mentioned, it's remarkable how many of them have changed unexpectedly. Conflict across Africa is down dramatically. The number of conflicts, the number of people killed in conflicts, the casualty counts are down. The war in Angola is over. The war in the Democratic Republic of Congo has been greatly reduced to more manageable proportions. The civil war in Sudan ended, although Sudan remains unstable. Certainly there are pockets of violence and insurgency, and there are worrisome cases, the Horn of Africa, Somalia being one example, Sudan, as I mentioned, and there are other areas, but the overall trend of violence in Africa over the past decade is down sharply, and that's good news. Secondly, the hopelessness, the economic hopelessness, was replaced by a decade of unprecedented growth, economic growth across the continent, growth rates, GDP growth rates on the order of 5 to 6%. In some cases, spectacular increases in the numbers of Africans who could be referred to as middle class. Africa's emergence as a major hydrocarbon producer, as Africa's continuing importance as a raw material producer, Africa's emerging importance as the last great reservoir of unused arable land in the world, which will be increasingly important as we deal with issues of food security in the future. You all have heard of the phenomenal rise of mobile telephony, cell phone use in Africa. Africa today is Facebook's fastest growing market. And by many economic indicators, Africa has done much better, and for reasons that we don't entirely understand, over the past decade. So from that headline in The Economist about the hopeless continent, now it's hard to open the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or Fortune magazine without finding some sort of an article about Africa. If you haven't got an investment strategy for Africa, you've probably missed the train. You've probably missed the boat. HIV/AIDS, the program that we inaugurated, President Bush inaugurated in 2003, the Global Fund alongside that, have had a dramatic impact in Africa in checking the progress of this epidemic. Certainly in putting millions of people on treatment, where a decade ago it was thought unlikely, if not impossible, that we would be able to do that. The rates of new infection are still too high in many places, but the worst clearly has been averted. The challenge now is how do we take this vast program, this vast investment on the part of American taxpayers, and turn it over to African governments and authorities so that they can begin to fund and administer these programs over the longer term. Finally, on terrorism, some of the concerns that we had back in 2001 now seem to be a little bit overwrought. One of the things we've discovered is that African populations have been somewhat more resistant than we anticipated to extremist messages or to terrorist recruitment. Yes, there are indigenous issues in the Horn of Africa, notably in Somalia, in the Sahel with Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and more recently in northern Nigeria with the emergence of Boko Haram. But all of these are far more in the way of local threats than they are global threats, and they are threats that are best managed. We have learned by working very closely with African partners and building the capacity of our African partners to deal with them. I wouldn't say that Africa is a success story. That would obviously be an exaggeration. It would be extrapolating a little bit too much from what I've just said. All the gains that I have mentioned here are reversible in Africa as they are elsewhere. But I think what we can say is that Africa is a lot more complex than many of us thought perhaps a decade ago. It is much more dynamic and much more important to us than it was a decade ago. And I hope that this week that you spent with us here at the Africa Center will allow all of you to understand and to delve into a little bit more deeply that complexity and the dynamism that exists on the continent today. We have a really great lineup of speakers for you this week, both administration officials who are very closely involved in some of the issues that I've just mentioned. We have really some top-notch academic experts and outside observers who are also going to come and talk to you. Really some, I think, of the best talent here in Washington, in addition to our own faculty here at ACSS. So I'm not only pleased with the good turnout, not only pleased with your interest, but also very pleased with the lineup that we've been able to bring to you. Let me talk just a little bit about the Africa Center. This is the obligatory part of my welcoming remarks to you. But it's also it's also important because our hope is that as you move into your, or as you continue in your present position or move into new positions with Africa-related responsibilities, you will think of us as a resource and as a partner. We would like to think of you as a participant, a potential participant in some of our future programs, and we would also welcome your help in locating other good participants for our programs, your contacts, your interlocutors, your colleagues who might also benefit from Africa Center programs. Okay, where's Susan? You're going to be doing the thumb work on this for me?
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Susan. Let's, we are one of 5 DoD regional centers. And this confusing map, which is almost as confusing as how we've distributed our combatant commands. There are 5 regional centers. The oldest is the Marshall Center in Garmisch, Germany. Some of you may be aware of its work on Europe and Eurasia. The Asia Pacific Center located in Honolulu. Those are the 2 oldest centers. The Africa Center, the Near East and South Asia, and the Hemispheric Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies are all located here at National Defense University. We are all very much alike. We have the same mandates. We simply work in different geographic regions. Next slide. This chain of command, again, it's a little bit confusing. The important factor here is that solid line between the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. It is OSD policy that provides all of the regional centers with their corporate guidance, with their overall guidance. We work closely with, we receive requests from, and we collaborate with a U.S. Africa Command. In many ways, our most important customer, client, and partner. We also work closely with the Africa Office, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Africa. We work very closely, it's not really listed here directly, but we work very closely with the State Department as well, particularly with the Africa Bureau in the State Department. Our executive agent is the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. So we have many dotted lines, one solid line, and this web of responsibilities is actually one that has worked out relatively well for us. Next slide, please. Here's what the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy, and her staff have given to the regional centers as their priorities. Enhancing regional security, strengthening institutional capacity. The whole of government approach is something that has really been added in the past several years, and it is increasingly important, I think, for all the centers. It's important for us as we go forward with our programs. We originally, like the other centers, focused heavily on military, that is African militaries, African military officers, and African military establishments. Increasingly, we have engaged civilians now. Our work is about 50% civilian, 50% military. The Africans themselves are insisting that they need more in the way of whole of government approaches if they are to effectively deal with the security challenges they face. They are not simply military problems that most of these governments are dealing with. They're, in fact, overwhelmingly civilian issues. So whole of government approaches have become increasingly important in our work. Next slide, please, Susan. Here are OSD's priority, OSD Africa priorities. They have, this is another layer here of granularity, a little more specific interest, emphasis on security sector reform. And I'll talk in a moment about some of the things that we're looking to do in West Africa this year. Transnational challenges, which is where the terrorist threat is now located, but alongside other threats such as narcotics trafficking, people smuggling, international crime. Peacekeeping and stability operations, building dynamic networks, and again, whole of government approaches. Next slide, please. This, in a sentence, is this is what we do. And I think this sums it up pretty well. Our job is to strengthen the strategic capacity of these states, of their military and civilian elites, to help them identify and analyze the main security challenges they're facing. And to do that in a way that promotes civil-military cooperation, respects democratic values, and safeguards human rights. And that pretty much sums up what it is we do at the strategic level with our African partners. Next slide, please. This is the ACSS organization. I don't think a lot needs to be said about this. I'll draw your attention to a couple of things. There on the upper right hand, you see we have a senior Portuguese and a senior French military officer. Those governments have created those billets, funded them, and provided us with senior officers who actually are members of our leadership team and work closely with us on every aspect of our programs, and have been particularly valuable in helping us gain access in the EU, and have been very helpful to us on the continent as well. One of the unique features and one of the things that I'm happiest that we've been able to continue, although the Portuguese have, we've had a gap with our Portuguese officers simply for budgetary reasons in Lisbon. On the lower left, you'll see that we have 2 regional offices. 2006, we opened a small office in Addis Ababa in order to better coordinate and be present alongside the African Union headquarters there. In 2008, we opened a small office in Senegal, West Africa, Dakar. We've had excellent relations with the government and military of Senegal, and that office has been really a very valuable regional hub for us. You'll see we have an academic affairs, communications and community affairs here. The academic, we have a very small faculty. You know, we have 7 faculty members all told. Is that right?
Yes.
7?
One senior.
And a handful then of academic associates and academic assistants. We do a lot with that small faculty, but we also reach outside our organization to bring in expertise for our specific programs, as we're doing with this program this week. Let's go to the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about what makes the Africa Center, I think, unique and somewhat unusual. First is our focus, as I said before, is entirely on strategic matters. We don't do any training. We don't do anything that's operational. We focus entirely on the strategic level with our African partners. We do very little that is bilateral. When we go to Africa, and we do most of our programs in Africa, we do sub-regional or regional gatherings. We have some bilateral work that we do, but by and large, we try to bring together multiple nationalities. Our methodology is a bit unusual in that everything we do, we try to coordinate and vet and discuss in advance with our African partners, so that we are not sitting around a table here in Washington figuring out what they need to know and going out and delivering to them what we think they need to hear. It is much more of a reciprocal process whereby we work with our African partners to determine what their real needs are and how we can help meet them. I mentioned a moment ago civilian and military, about a 50-50 split now in our courses and our programs in Africa between civilians and military. Most of our programs are conducted on the continent in Africa. We're very expeditionary in that sense. The room that you all are sitting in now does not belong to us. This belongs to National Defense University. We don't have a classroom. We don't have laboratories. We don't have space here in Washington to conduct gatherings of this size. So we pack our gear and we go there, not just because we don't have space, but also because for different reasons we think it's a good thing to do. 95% of our programs are in 3 languages. That is, we work simultaneously in French, English, and Portuguese. And that is simultaneous translation, interpretation, both in our plenary sessions and in our discussion groups. And as my colleagues have heard me say, this is a big cost item. It's not cheap to operate in 3 languages, but it is vital for us to be able to reach out to the people that we need to engage. And a strict non-attribution policy. Everything we do in our courses is under the Chatham House rule. It's important that our participants not worry that something they say might be reported back to their authorities or superiors or bureaucratic enemies or whatever in their capital. So we try to encourage candor and open exchanges by strictly enforcing the Chatham House rule. The thematic pillars here are the 5 areas where we have distributed our faculty and generally, historically, have concentrated a lot of our programming. And in each of these areas, each of these thematic pillars will appear in our different programs. National security strategy development, very important for many African militaries who really don't have that capacity. Transnational threats and counterterrorism, obviously, as important to us as it is to them. Civil-military relations, promoting good civil-military relations in Africa remains a high priority. Defense economics and resourcing and budgets. One of the best things we can do is to work with African militaries to help them figure out how do they manage these limited resources that they have. How should they be spending their money? That certainly is, I think, one of the most important offerings that we have. And then conflict prevention and management. Next slide, please, Susan. Just a sampling of some of our programs. Our Senior Leaders Seminar. We bring together, in the past we brought together about 100 senior civilian and military leaders for a 2-week period, focusing on strategic challenges and trends, focusing on those 5 thematic pillars I mentioned. This is our flagship program. Over time, it's really produced the largest number, I think, of our alumni. I don't think we have the statistics here, but a fair number of defense ministers, chiefs of military staff, deputy CHODs, parliamentary leaders are counted among our alumni and alumni of that particular course. The African Executive Dialogue is a new course that we'll offer this year. We've decided that it's hard to get really senior people to break away for 2 weeks from their schedules, and so we're going to create a new format, which is a 2-day conference where very senior African leaders bring them to Washington, give them an opportunity to interact with some senior American officials, and this will be, I hope, a new flagship, very, very, very precise, but a new flagship program for the Center of the African Executive Dialogue, which I hope will debut in November here in Washington. Next Generation of African Military Leaders. This is our only course that is entirely military. These are at the lieutenant colonel commander level. We bring about 65 to 75 African military officials here to Washington every year for a 4-week course with a heavy focus on ethics, professionalism, civil military relations, generally how they can prepare themselves for leadership positions in their countries. The Introduction to African Security Issues course, of course, which you are all participating in here. We do this twice a year. We also do a program every year for African defense attachés. Newly arrived defense attachés or political military officers in the African embassies who are learning their way around Washington, don't quite understand perhaps the relations between the Hill and the executive or relations between the Pentagon and the State Department, and we try to give them a week where we help them to navigate through that. Next slide, please. You know, those are, I just mentioned some of our foundational programs. Those are programs that we do every year. These are programs that we do as the need arises or as opportunities arise. And these are some of the subjects that we have looked at in the past couple of years that have been particularly important. Countering radicalization, we have migrated a bit away from strictly focusing on counterterrorism to trying to identify the drivers of violent extremism and how whole of government approaches in Africa can be used to diagnose and to deal with violent extremism as it takes shape in different African contexts. We had a very good conference in Dakar earlier this year, and we'll be doing another one in East Africa, I hope, at the beginning of 2012. Maritime safety and security has become a big issue all around Africa, initially because of the piracy in the Gulf of Aden, Somalia, now more recently because of the piracy and the lawlessness in the Gulf of Guinea. African countries have generally, over the past 18 months, come to the realization that much more does need to be done for them to gain maritime awareness of their maritime space, to coordinate efforts, and to figure out how they deal with, how they police these vulnerable zones. This has been an area where AFRICOM has also been very active. So there's been a great demand for more work on maritime security, and we put together a major conference last year in Dar es Salaam together with the African Union to try to figure out a continent-wide strategy, and have been following that up with a series of events over in the sub-regions to help clusters of states develop regional, sub-regional strategies, maritime security. Counter-narcotics, managing security sector resources. I won't get into all the details there, but that's a indicative list. Next slide. We do some programs. We do a number of programs in support of Africa Command, and I've listed a few of them here. An academic symposium, which we've done 5 of these over the years, which bring together AFRICOM with leading African intellectuals and academics and journalists who in the early years certainly were, for the most part, virulently opposed to the installation of AFRICOM or the presence of AFRICOM on the African continent. This was an opportunity for those groups and AFRICOM to exchange views, to get to know each other, and to create, I think, a more positive atmosphere, which I think over the years has served its purpose. I mentioned maritime safety and security. A couple of years ago, we decided, together with Africa Command, that it might not be a bad idea to take the senior-most warrant officers, the NCOs, in some of these countries, and bring them here to Washington for a week-long course similar to what we were providing to officers. There was a lot of skepticism about whether that would actually work. It worked extremely well, and we're going to turn this into a regular fixture. We had, I guess over the last 2 years, we probably had 25 or 30 senior warrant officers across Africa who've been amongst our most active and energetic and enthusiastic participants, and most willing to stay in touch with us and to continue to be part of the Africa Center family after the completion of the courses. So that has been a very positive development. We do a fair amount for CJTF HOA. We, over the years, have conducted courses for their personnel prior to their deployment to Djibouti. We helped with the Air Chiefs Conference in Addis Ababa earlier this year, and we've helped with the U.S. Army Africa's Summit in the past as well. Those are support programs where we essentially take our faculty, our expertise, and help build some of the content for these programs that are being offered by the Combatant Command and its components. And there are several research projects here that I'll talk about research in a moment, but these are some of the research projects that AFRICOM has asked us to undertake, and which our small research department is doing. Let's go to the next slide. I want to move on away from the academics now to something slightly different. You know, it's great to be able to identify participants with programs, bring them in and provide a good academic program. But what's even more important in the long run is what do we do in order to stay in touch with these people? How do we stay connected? How do we build this network? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Let's see, is that, yeah, I don't know that we set this up quite in the way that I need to in order to talk about it, but let me say that several years ago, we came up with the idea, let's form community chapters, or rather, let's encourage our alumni, when they go home, to form an alumni association. We'll call it a community chapter. We were able to provide a little bit of funding initially, but after a year or two, we were told, actually, we can't provide funding to these community chapters across Africa. They're on their own. We then came up with a concept of supporting these chapters, which was to bring them at least once a year a program from Washington, a bilateral program, something that was of specific interest to them. So every year now, we go out to every one of our community chapters around the continent, and we take a one-day program, a symposium, maybe a two-day program to them. And we provide them with advice on on how they can build their capacity, how they can fundraise, how they can handle their media relations, how they can organize themselves a little bit better. We have, I think now, correct me, 29 chapters across Africa. Some of them are very vibrant, self-sustaining, very active, others a little bit less so. But the TOPS program here, the Topical Outreach Program Series, has really been the key element in cementing relations with our alumni in Africa. And this is going to be probably the area of greatest emphasis for us in the future. Next slide. Here are some of the TOPS programs, popular themes that we took out to Africa in this fiscal year. And again, these are issues that, I'm sorry. Yes, that's this year. These are issues that the chapters themselves identified as most important. You see a map there, you can see where we have our community chapters. Let's see if that's completely up to date. I think it is. 29 chapters in 28 countries. Let's go to this next slide, please. Strategic research. 3 years ago, we established a small research operation, and we did provide it with adequate funding. And in these 3 years, we have, I'm extremely pleased with the products that our research team has been able to produce. Not only from our own faculty, but we have gone outside to commission work from experts, including a number of African scholars and thinkers, to produce a series of timely policy studies on and some longer policy reports on issues that are of current importance and of policy relevance to Washington, to the Washington establishment. And I don't know if we have some of those papers here, whether we're going to be distributing them. Yeah, we have a table here, but I would invite you to go through some of these documents and also to visit our website, which I'll talk about in a moment, because I'm very pleased. I think this is some of the best, immodestly think that this is some of the best work coming out now on current African security issues. And I'm very gratified that we've had a budget that's allowed us to do that. Next slide is our public affairs. I think the main thing to be said here is to draw attention to our website. There are 3 things of interest on this website. In the upper left-hand corner, there is every day a new media review, a selection of 20 articles in English and 20 in French from around the African continent, which we hope capture headlines from Africa, a lot over the past 6 months, needless to say, on Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, a lot of coverage on Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of coverage on Sudan. I find this my first stop every morning is to check the media review on the website to get a good overview of what's happening. And most of this is not information from the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Financial Times, but a lot of this from African media or international media, not necessarily what you would be getting on your morning radio or your morning newspapers here. Next slide, please. This is just to give you a sense of how our program calendar looks for the next year. And as a way of saying that we are a small center, but we are constantly in motion. And much of what you see up there is taking place in Africa, as I said before, not here in Washington. We won't talk about, next slide, that's it. We won't talk too much about budget situations. We will, that's an evolving story, and we expect to have more information shortly. I suspect that our center, like the other regional centers, will face cutbacks over the next several years. And the challenge for our organization, as for many, is transitioning from what has been a culture of steady growth over a decade of programs and personnel to one where we're really going to have to prioritize much more carefully and be very careful about how we spend our money. So we're going to be going into a period of austerity, almost certainly. And it is going to result in some changes, although I can't predict right now what they're going to look like. What will not change is the overall focus of what we do, the strategic focus, working with African partners, and doing all of that in a way that supports the combatant command and the overall interests of DoD and the USG.